In the scorching heat of a June afternoon in 1560, thunder rolled across the hills of central Japan. But this was not the rumble of an approaching storm. This was the sound of 25,000 warriors marching toward what they believed would be their destiny. At their head rode Imagawa Yoshimoto, one of the most powerful warlords in all of Japan, his banners streaming in the wind, his armor glinting like gold in the summer Sunday. He commanded an army so vast that observers claimed it stretched beyond the horizon. His goal was nothing less than the conquest of the entire nation. Standing in his path was a young upstart named Oda Nobunaga, dismissed by his own people as the great fool of Owari. With barely 3,000 men, outnumbered nearly 10 to 1, facing certain annihilation against one of Japan's mightiest forces, every military expert of the time predicted his swift and brutal defeat. Yet what happened next would send shockwaves across the entire archipelago and change the course of Japanese history forever. This is the story of the Battle of Okehazama, where the impossible became reality, where a single afternoon shattered the dreams of empire and forged the legend of the man who would unite Japan under one banner. It was a clash that would prove that in the brutal world of the samurai, victory belonged not to the largest army, but to the boldest heart. The year 1560 found Japan drowning in chaos. For over a century, the island nation had been consumed by the Sengoku period, the age of warring states, where regional warlords battled endlessly for supremacy, while the once mighty Ashikaga shogunate crumbled into irrelevance. Villages burned, families were torn apart, and the very fabric of society seemed to be unraveling. In this fractured landscape of constant warfare, power belonged to those strong enough to seize it and cunning enough to hold it. Among the most formidable of these warlords was Imagawa Yoshimoto, master of 3 provinces and commander of one of the most disciplined armies in Japan. From his stronghold in Suruga, he had spent decades carefully building his power through strategic alliances and calculated conquests. By 1560, he controlled vast territories along the crucial Tōkaidō Road, the lifeline connecting eastern and western Japan. His domain stretched across fertile valleys and busy trade routes, generating the wealth needed to maintain his massive military machine. Yoshimoto was no mere brute warrior. He was a cultured man, a poet who appreciated the finer things in life, yet beneath his refined exterior burned the ambition of a conqueror. He had forged the powerful Koso-Sun alliance, uniting his forces with the Takeda clan of Kai and the Hojo clan of Sagami, creating a confederation that dominated eastern Japan. With this alliance secured, Yoshimoto turned his gaze westward toward the ultimate prize, the imperial capital of Kyoto, and the right to rule all of Japan. The path to Kyoto led through Owari province, a relatively small domain wedged between the mountains and the sea. Here ruled a man many considered utterly unfit for leadership. Oda Nobunaga, the second son of a minor deputy governor, had earned the mocking title of the Great Fool of Owari through his outrageous behavior and apparent disregard for tradition. While other young nobles practiced calligraphy and studied poetry, Nobunaga could be found consorting with merchants and common soldiers, learning their trades and understanding their concerns. When his father died in 1551, leaving him the inheritance at just 17 years old, many expected the Oda clan to collapse within months. Nobunaga's own relatives challenged his authority, viewing him as weak and inexperienced. Yet, through a combination of ruthless determination and unconventional tactics, the young lord had systematically eliminated his rivals. By 1560, he had finally consolidated control over his domain. But his forces remained pitifully small compared to the giants surrounding him. As spring turned to summer in 1560, Yoshimoto's preparations for his grand campaign reached their climax. From across his 3 provinces, warriors converged on his banner. Mounted samurai in gleaming armor, disciplined ashigaru foot soldiers with their long spears, and skilled archers with their deadly accurate bows. Supply trains stretched for miles, carrying rice, weapons, and siege equipment. The very earth seemed to tremble under the weight of this massive host as it began its westward march. Yoshimoto deliberately spread word that his army numbered 40,000 men, a psychological tactic designed to terrify potential opponents into submission without a fight. The truth was impressive enough, Over 25,000 battle-hardened warriors, veterans of countless campaigns, united under the command of one of Japan's most experienced generals. As news of the approaching army spread, panic swept through the smaller domains in its path. Most local lords wisely chose submission over annihilation. The strategic situation was crystal clear to any military observer. Yoshimoto's route would take him directly through Owari province, where the upstart Nobunaga waited with his laughably small force. The smart money was on Nobunaga, fleeing to his castle at Kyoto, and hoping the walls would hold long enough for him to negotiate favorable surrender terms. No sane commander would consider facing such overwhelming odds in open battle. Yet as reports reached Nobunaga of the Imagawa advance, his response shocked even his closest advisors. Rather than preparing for a siege or seeking terms for surrender, he began planning an attack. His senior retainers pleaded with him to see reason. They pointed to the impossible mathematics of the situation, the certain destruction that awaited them, the wisdom of living to fight another day. But Nobunaga had made his decision with the cold calculation that would define his career. He understood something his advisors did not. Kyoto Castle, impressive as it appeared, could not withstand a prolonged siege by such a massive force. Surrender would mean the end of the Oda clan and his own execution. Flight would only delay the inevitable. If he was going to die, he would die on his own terms, taking as many enemies with him as possible. But more than that, Nobunaga sensed an opportunity that others could not see. Large armies moved slowly, required constant supplies, and often grew overconfident in their own power. As Yoshimoto's forces crossed into Owari territory in early June, they encountered their first resistance at the border fortresses of Washizu and Marune. These small castles, garrisoned by handfuls of Oda retainers, stood no chance against the Imagawa juggernaut. Yet their defenders fought with desperate courage, forcing Yoshimoto to deploy significant portions of his army and expend precious time reducing these obstacles. What should have been simple mopping-up operations became prolonged affairs that slowed the advance and began to fray tempers in the Imagawa ranks. The fall of these border fortresses sent a clear message throughout Owari. The storm was coming, and nothing could stop it. Villages emptied as civilians fled westward, carrying what possessions they could. Smoke rose from burning fields as retreating defenders implemented scorched earth tactics, denying supplies to the invaders. The roads became clogged with refugees, their faces etched with the terror of those who had seen war's true face. In Kyoto Castle, Nobunaga's war council convened for what many believed would be their final meeting. Around the low table sat the cream of Owari's military leadership, men who had served the Oda family for generations. Their faces were grim as they contemplated the approaching catastrophe. Scout reports confirmed their worst fears. The Imagawa army was enormous, well-equipped, and commanded by generals with decades of experience. Against such a force, their small domain seemed as fragile as rice paper in a typhoon. Yet, as the debate raged around him, Nobunaga remained eerily calm. While his retainers argued about defensive positions and supply lines, he studied maps and questioned every scout personally about the enemy's movements and dispositions. He wanted to know not just where Yoshimoto was going, but how he was getting there, where he rested, how his men were deployed. Information, Nobunaga had learned, was often more valuable than steel. The geography of the approaching battle zone was intimately familiar to Nobunaga and his men. For years, they had used these hills and valleys for hunting expeditions and military exercises. Every stream, every ridge, every hidden path was known to them. This local knowledge would prove more precious than gold in the hours to come. As Yoshimoto's massive army drew closer to the heart of Owari, confident in their overwhelming strength, they marched unknowingly toward an appointment with destiny that would echo through the centuries. The morning of June 19th brought disturbing news to Yoshimoto's camp. His advance scouts reported that Nobunaga had abandoned the obvious defensive strategy. Instead of retreating to Kyoto Castle as expected, the Oda forces were moving eastward, directly toward the Imagawa positions. This intelligence puzzled Yoshimoto's commanders. Was the fool of Owari truly planning to attack their vastly superior army? The very notion seemed so absurd that many dismissed it as a desperate bluff or a feint designed to mask Nobunaga's true intentions. Yoshimoto himself received this news with a mixture of amusement and contempt. He had expected Nobunaga to cower behind castle walls, perhaps sending envoys to negotiate terms of surrender. The idea that this upstart would dare challenge the might of the Imagawa on the open field struck him as the final proof of Nobunaga's legendary foolishness. If the young lord wished to throw away his life and his clan's future in a single reckless gesture, so be it. The battle would be over before the sun reached its zenith. As the Imagawa host resumed its westward march, the mood among the ranks was one of confident anticipation. Veterans shared stories of past victories, while new recruits eagerly awaited their first taste of glory. The supply trains rumbled along behind the main force, carrying not just weapons and provisions, but also the ceremonial gear Yoshimoto would need for his triumphal entry into Kyoto. Banners fluttered in the warm breeze, displaying the proud crests of dozens of samurai families. This was not merely an army on the march. It was the visible manifestation of a new order preparing to sweep across Japan. Yet beneath this veneer of confidence, subtle signs of strain were beginning to show. The prolonged siege of the border fortresses had cost more time than anticipated. Supply lines stretched thin as the massive army consumed vast quantities of rice and fodder daily. The June heat was brutal, and many soldiers had begun to shed pieces of their armor to stay comfortable during the long march. Discipline, while still strong, had relaxed somewhat as victory seemed assured, and the enemy appeared to be fleeing rather than fighting. Meanwhile, in the Oda ranks, a very different mood prevailed. Nobunaga had spent the previous evening addressing his men, not with grand speeches about honor and glory, but with cold, practical assessments of their situation. He reminded them that they faced annihilation if they remained passive, but that bold action might yet snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. His words carried the weight of absolute conviction. This was not a man seeking a glorious death, but a commander who genuinely believed he could win. The dawn of June 20th found Nobunaga rising before his men, consuming a simple meal of rice while standing, his movements quick and purposeful. He had chosen his attire carefully, donning armor that was functional rather than ornate, designed for combat rather than ceremony. Before departing Kyoto, he paused at the castle's shrine, reciting a passage from the ancient song Atsumori that spoke of life's fleeting nature. It was a moment of quiet contemplation before the storm. His force was pitifully small by the standards of the age, barely 3,000 men, many of them Ashigaru foot soldiers rather than mounted samurai. Yet what they lacked in numbers, they made up for in intimate knowledge of the terrain and absolute faith in their leader. These were not reluctant conscripts dragged from their fields, but professional soldiers who had chosen to follow Nobunaga despite the odds. They moved with the quiet efficiency of men who knew their business and trusted their commander's judgment. The route Nobunaga chose took his army along familiar paths through the hills south of the main Tōkaidō Road. His men moved in small groups to avoid detection, using valleys and forest cover to mask their approach. This was not the grand procession of a traditional samurai army, but the swift advance of hunters stalking dangerous prey. Scouts ranged ahead, bringing back constant reports on Imagawa positions and movements. Every piece of information was analyzed and incorporated into Nobunaga's evolving battle plan. As the Oda forces approached their objective, Nobunaga made a decision that revealed both his tactical brilliance and his understanding of psychological warfare. Rather than hiding his presence, he ordered his men to establish a temporary camp near the fortified temple of Zenshōji, clearly visible to any Imagawa scouts in the area. But this was no ordinary encampment. His soldiers planted dozens of banners and standards around the temple grounds, creating the illusion of a much larger force. From a distance, the forest of flags suggested that Nobunaga had somehow assembled an army capable of challenging the Imagawa on equal terms. This deception served multiple purposes. It would confuse enemy intelligence about Oda's strength and dispositions. It might cause Yoshimoto to deploy his forces more cautiously than necessary. Most importantly, it demonstrated to Nobunaga's own men that their leader was thinking several moves ahead, using cunning and misdirection to level the playing field. The great fool of Owari was revealing himself to be anything but foolish. The Imagawa scouts who observed this display carried their reports back to Yoshimoto's headquarters with growing concern. The enemy force appeared larger than expected, and its positioning suggested tactical sophistication rather than desperate panic. For the first time since beginning his march, Yoshimoto found himself forced to consider that this battle might not be the simple massacre he had anticipated. Yet his confidence remained unshaken. Even if Nobunaga had managed to assemble 5,000 men, the numerical advantage still lay overwhelmingly with the Imagawa. As the afternoon of June 20th wore on, both armies maneuvered toward their chosen positions. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of two clans, but the future direction of Japanese history. In the hills around Okehazama, ancient forces were converging. Tradition against innovation, overwhelming strength against desperate cunning, the established order against the chaos of change. Yoshimoto established his main camp in a narrow valley called Dengaku-hazama, a natural amphitheater surrounded by wooded hills. It was a strong defensive position that would allow his army to rest while maintaining good visibility of the surrounding terrain. His commanders deployed the various contingents with practiced efficiency, creating overlapping fields of fire and establishing clear lines of communication. The Imagawa war machine settled into position like a great beast preparing to spring. The heat of the day was becoming oppressive, and many soldiers gratefully accepted the chance to rest in whatever shade they could find. Armor was loosened, weapons set aside, and the first sake began to flow as the men celebrated their recent victories at the border fortresses. The mood was festive rather than martial, more reminiscent of a victory celebration than an army preparing for battle. After all, what threat could the pitiful Oda forces possibly pose to such a magnificent host? Yet even as his enemies relaxed, Nobunaga was putting the final touches on a plan that would astonish the world. His intimate knowledge of the local terrain had revealed to him possibilities that no outsider could perceive. The very geography that made Yoshimoto's position defensively strong also made it vulnerable to certain forms of attack. The wooded hills that provided such excellent observation posts could also conceal an approaching enemy until the final moments. The narrow valley that concentrated Imagawa's strength also limited their ability to maneuver when threatened. Most crucially, Nobunaga had recognized something that Yoshimoto's more conventional military thinking had missed. Large armies were powerful, but they were also unwieldy. They required time to react to changing circumstances, time to relay orders through chains of command, time to redeploy forces from one position to another. A smaller, more agile force that could strike with perfect timing and absolute surprise might achieve what seemed impossible through conventional means. As the sun climbed toward its zenith on what would become one of the most famous days in Japanese military history, both commanders made their final preparations. Yoshimoto, secure in his overwhelming advantage, planned to rest his forces through the heat of the day before resuming the advance toward Kyoto Castle. Nobunaga, knowing that every passing moment brought him closer to discovery and defeat, prepared to gamble everything on a single desperate throw of the dice. The stage was set, the players were in position, and destiny waited in the wings. In the hills of Okehazama, the impossible was about to become reality. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over the hills of Okehazama as both armies settled into their positions. In the Imagawa camp, the atmosphere had shifted from military precision to casual celebration. Soldiers lounged in whatever shade they could find, their armor unbuckled and weapons carelessly stacked nearby. Rice wine flowed freely as veterans regaled younger warriors with tales of past conquests. The recent victories at Washizu and Marune had filled the ranks with confidence, and many believed the hardest fighting was already behind them. Yoshimoto himself had established his command post in an elaborate pavilion at the heart of the camp. Silk banners displaying his family crest fluttered in the humid air while servants attended to his every need. Maps were spread across low tables, but they showed routes to Kyoto rather than tactical dispositions around Okehazama. In his mind, this was merely a rest stop on the road to greater glory. The real campaign would begin once they reached the capital and began dismantling what remained of the Ashikaga shogunate. The great warlord had every reason for confidence. His intelligence network had confirmed that Nobunaga's force numbered no more than 3,000 men. Even accounting for possible reinforcements, the mathematical reality was inescapable. The Imagawa enjoyed at least an 8-to-1 advantage in numbers, supplemented by superior equipment, more experienced commanders, and a proven track record of victory. By every conventional measure of military strength, the outcome was predetermined. Yet high in the wooded hills surrounding the valley, a different kind of preparation was taking place. Nobunaga had divided his small force into even smaller units, each moving independently through terrain they knew as intimately as their own homes. These were not the grand formations beloved by traditional warfare, but something entirely new, compact groups of professional soldiers moving with the stealth and purpose of assassins. Every man knew his role in the coming assault. The Ashigaru spearmen would form the striking edge, their long weapons perfect for the close quarters fighting that Nobunaga envisioned. Behind them came the samurai, ready to exploit whatever breakthrough the initial assault achieved. Archers were positioned to provide covering fire from concealed positions among the trees. Most importantly, every soldier understood that surprise was their only advantage, and once lost, it could never be regained. As the day wore on, the heat became almost unbearable. In the Imagawa camp below, more and more soldiers had shed their armor entirely, seeking relief from the oppressive temperature. What had begun as a tactical rest had evolved into something approaching a festival. Cooking fires sent columns of smoke into the still air while the sound of laughter and conversation echoed off the surrounding hills. It was the sound of an army that believed itself invincible. Nobunaga observed this scene from his concealed position with the cold calculation of a predator studying its prey. Every detail was noted and analyzed. The disposition of guards, the location of command posts, the routes between different sections of the camp. His scouts had spent hours mapping the enemy positions, identifying weak points and escape routes. This was intelligence warfare at its finest, the systematic gathering of information that would be transformed into tactical advantage. The afternoon shadows were beginning to lengthen when nature herself seemed to conspire in Nobunaga's favor. Dark clouds had been building on the western horizon throughout the day, and now they began to advance across the sky with ominous purpose. The air grew heavy and still, charged with the electric tension that precedes a thunderstorm. Veterans in both armies recognized the signs and began preparing for the deluge that was surely coming. In the Imagawa camp, this development was viewed as a minor inconvenience. Servants rushed to secure pavilions and equipment, while soldiers sought whatever shelter they could find. The coming storm would delay their advance by a few hours, but nothing more. Some commanders even welcomed the prospect of cooler temperatures and relief from the oppressive heat that had dominated the day. Nobunaga saw something entirely different in those gathering clouds. Here was the perfect cover for his assault, a gift from the gods that would mask his approach until the final moments. He had always believed that victory belonged to those bold enough to seize unexpected opportunities, and this was exactly such a moment. His men received their final orders with grim determination. They would attack during the height of the storm, using the chaos and confusion to multiply the effect of their surprise. The first fat raindrops began to fall as the Oda forces moved into their final positions. Thunder rumbled across the hills, drowning out the sound of footsteps and the whispered commands that coordinated their advance. Lightning split the darkening sky, illuminating the valley below in brief, stark flashes that revealed an enemy caught completely unprepared for what was about to unfold. In those final moments before the storm reached its full fury, both armies waited in very different states of readiness. The Imagawa huddled under whatever shelter they could improvise, their weapons set aside, their armor removed, their attention focused entirely on staying dry. They were a mighty host, reduced to the level of common travelers caught in a sudden downpour. High above them in the wooded hills, 3,000 Oda warriors crouched in the rain with weapons ready and hearts steeled for the fight of their lives. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and facing almost certain death. Yet they possessed something their enemies lacked in that crucial moment: absolute unity of purpose and the unshakable belief that their leader could achieve the impossible. The storm struck with sudden violence, transforming the peaceful valley into a cauldron of wind and rain. Visibility dropped to mere yards as sheets of water swept across the landscape. Thunder crashed overhead with deafening force, while lightning turned the world into a series of frozen tableaux. It was as if the very heavens had opened to witness what was about to unfold. Through this tempest came death itself. moving with silent purpose down the wooded slopes. Nobunaga led from the front, his figure barely visible through the driving rain as he guided his men toward their destiny. Behind him stretched a line of warriors who had chosen to follow their lord into what every rational calculation said was certain doom. They moved like ghosts through the storm, their footsteps masked by thunder, their approach hidden by the very fury of nature itself. The Imagawa sentries, such as they were, had long since abandoned their posts for whatever dry ground they could find. Those few who remained at their positions were focused entirely on the discomfort of the moment, rather than watching for enemies that no sane commander would deploy in such conditions. The very impossibility of an attack during the height of the storm had become the perfect guarantee that such an attack would go undetected. The Battle of Okehazama shattered every assumption about warfare in 16th century Japan. In a single afternoon of thunder and steel, Nobunaga transformed himself from the fool of Owari into the architect of a unified nation. Yoshimoto's dream of empire died with him in that rain-soaked valley, while the young upstart who dared challenge the impossible would go on to reshape Japanese history. Sometimes the greatest victories belong not to the mightiest army, but to those bold enough to strike when others believe victory is impossible.